if I would speak about regulation in 10 minutes, it's just about impossible to talk about regulation of crowdfunding in 10 minutes. It's such a fantastically diverse subject. And so what I'm going to suggest to you that I cover this proposition. Crowdfunding is new finance, it's better finance, it brings many additional benefits and dynamics that make it very distinctive from digital finance. And bad regulation will damage it, constrain it, and reduce its inherent benefits. And I think that the regulation of crowdfunding needs to be completely rethought. And I'm basing that on the experience that I've seen what's happening in the UK. But if we look around the world, there are a diversity of approaches to regulating the crowdfunding space. And thus far, nobody's got it right as far as I'm concerned. So I intend to go through this as quickly as I possibly can, because I know you're up against it. So quick mention, I'm not a lawyer. I'm a management consultant with a specialism in crowdfunding, so I'm not a lawyer. But people think that my slightly critical approach to regulation thinks that I'm anti-regulation. I'd like to emphasize I'm not anti-regulation. What I'm against is bad regulation. And so this is not going to be something that decries regulation. It has its place, but what I am against is bad regulation. So in order to do this in the way that I have set out there, is I just want to emphasize what I think makes crowdfunding different from traditional finance, because most of our regulatory frameworks are based on an approach to regulating traditional finance. So what's different about crowdfunding? What do we need to pay attention to? Well, I won't go through all of these things. I could have added other things to this list, but fundamentally it's new money coming into the marketplace that otherwise wouldn't be there. It's much more diverse because the participants involved with the investment process are much more broadly sourced from the crowd. And many of these bring very novel expectations of return, which are different from traditional expectations in the traditional financial markets. It's much closer to the marketplace, so those people that are seeking to raise funds for products and services are often doing so alongside people who will be procuring those products and services with them. So it's, as in the case of crowdsourcing, we can find that this has many benefits for the crowdfunding marketplace. It's lower cost, it's quick money because you can source this money very quickly, but it's also slow money because it's quite patient money. Many of these assets that are purchased are non-tradable, they're not liquid, so this is not going anywhere. It's very stable. Often the investors are brand loyal, and so they are investing for different expectations. And it's often locally focused, so brings in additional benefits to the local community. So if we accept that the crowdfunding is different, it has these specific additional value and distinctive values over and above traditional funding. What are the issues with regulation? Let's start with why do we actually regulate? This is very broad brushstrokes, but you can apply these principles across most of the regulatory frameworks. We regulate for a number of reasons. One is we want to try and mitigate the risk involved with the investment process for all the participants involved. So this is one of the purposes that we're seeking to regulate for. We're trying to build confidence in the marketplace, so that the people that are actually engaged in the transactions are more confident to do so. They feel that they're doing it in a way that is safe, that is purposeful, and that there are some kind of rules around the way in which these things are transacted. And the end result of that is we want to grow the marketplace. We want it to become bigger and become more vibrant. So those things all hang together. Now, if we accept that they are the purposes of regulations, we have to think about how that fits in a crowdfunding context, as distinct from a traditional finance context. And one of the things that is generally overlooked, in my estimation, by the regulators, is that crowdfunding risk mitigation works in a slightly different way. It has certain philosophical underpinnings that make it very different. The key to some of these things are the idea of atomization. So the individual investments are very tiny. We're looking at a long tail distribution, which is typical of many of the digital disruptions that we've seen in the last 10 to 20 years. So in this case, in an investment scenario, we are looking for a large number of very small investments rather than a small number of large investments. And consequently, each of those investment pieces is small enough that in the event of it failing or being lost, it's not going to bring down the entire portfolio. So the risk perspective and the risk profile for the investor is very different. High levels of transparency. These are publicly transacted processes. great deal of transparency. We don't have the asymmetry of access to information, which is typical of the traditional financial markets. And it is the crowd that does a great deal of the scrutiny and diligence. And the advantage of that is you have a very diverse set of scrutineers bringing different metrics, different understandings, and different approaches to uncover things in a very, very open way. And it's a much more rigorous approach than many of the traditional funding scrutinies, because they're typically undertaken by a small number of people who are all using exactly the same lenses and metrics. So these are the way that crowdfunding mitigates its risk. And any regulation must pay attention to these and honor them. Similarly, in the way that the crowdfunding can grow, it requires certain fundamentals to be in place. Low transaction costs, so that we can actually manage this process effectively of pulling together many, many tiny transactions and not lose the value of that through transactional cost. Very low barriers to participation. So the more people that can participate, the better. It is essentially the crowd that we want to bring in. So again, regulatory frameworks need to pay attention to these things and not introduce too much in the way of transaction costs or bar people to entry. So if we think about the four main models, the success funding, the gift or donation or the perk reward, loan, debt and equity, it's typically the loan and equity ones that are subject to the most regulation, but we must lose sight of the fact that the others are all subject to IP regulations, money transfer regulations, etc. But it's the loan and equity models that attract most of the interest in terms of a regulatory approach. And how typically do the regulators go about managing this arena? Now this again is very broad brushstrokes, but you can think about this in any of the legal jurisdictions around the world in their approach to this. Typically they will determine or gauge who can actually participate in this process. This is a very, very typical mechanism of deciding who is eligible to participate. They also typically regulate the amount of information that's exchanged, the format that it operates in and is exchanged, and who can get to see it, and the form that it's shaped in. And then there are a series of regulations of behavioral considerations of what you can and cannot do within those contexts. So these are the kind of the three ways that typically these regulators approach the process of managing the marketplaces. Now, there are two distinctive responses. If you look across the crowdfunding world, there are two distinctive approaches for crowdfunding platforms in addressing this, and they spring from two different legal traditions. And I refer to them as the common law approach and the Napoleonic Code. Now, these are just my terms for describing it, but these are two different distinctive traditions that you can see in many of the different jurisdictions around the world. Now, the common law approach is a tradition which we have within the UK, for example, which is there are a series of regulations set out there that financial transactions and investment transactions are governed by. And as long as you satisfy them sufficiently, you're permitted to undertake a crowdfunding process. Now, the other tradition, which might be exemplified by somewhere like Italy, for example, there is an expectation that there has to be a specific law that permits you specifically to undertake that process. And they are two entirely different traditions, and one has led to a much greater innovation and a more creative approach to crowdfunding, and the other has presented significant problems for those particular jurisdictions in introducing crowdfunding. So let's look at that in a little bit more detail. The common law approach means that there are a whole series of things that one needs to commit to and respect, but you find paths through these. You find a mechanism of satisfying the regulations as they're set out in order to actually transact your crowdfunding operation. So people satisfy these regulations in lots of different ways. They can be tremendously innovative in the approaches that they use. So they might outsource regulated activities. They might seek to become regulated bodies themselves. They can change the nature of the investment vehicle so that it satisfies certain requirements. and is not a direct investment model. They can operate below certain thresholds. So, for example, within Europe, there is a directive which means that investments that are seeking to raise a sum of money below a certain threshold are not required to produce prospectuses, which can be tremendously expensive operations to do. So as long as you're operating within those thresholds, you can do it. And of course, there are mechanisms of gating who can actually participate. My argument would be that the more you gate, the less you're actually undertaking crowdfunding. And there's an awful lot of crowdfunding platforms out there that call themselves crowdfunding, which in my estimation are not, because of the way that they gate access. So you can imagine in this mode there's a lot of creativity about how you satisfy the various requirements. Now the other model is the Napoleonic Code, where you are presented with roadblocks that will prevent you from actually transacting any crowdfunding because it is not specifically permitted. And the only way that it will ever be operationalized is through the issuing of a new statute, a new regulation that will make it happen. And we can see this in lots of places. Those of you that know me will realize that that is my gratuitous inclusion of a picture of an elephant, because I always try and get a picture of an elephant into my presentations because I like it. So, let's look at those in some specifics. It's a common misconception in the UK that equity crowdfunding was unregulated prior to April 2014. Equity-based crowdfunding in the UK has always been regulated. The mechanisms that people have sought to approach this were the common law method. That is to say that the crowdfunding platforms found ways of satisfying existing requirements. Post-April 2014, the FCA brought in additional regulations that were specific to crowdfunding. And whilst the FCA will tell you that the thriving crowdfunding regime within the UK is a testament to their wonderful regulatory approach, I disagree. UK equity crowdfunding exists in spite of the regulators, not because of it. So the FCA are benefiting from the common law traditions of the UK rather than the specifics of their regulations. But they've brought in additional regulations which basically classify investors on sophisticated or people like me too stupid to be able to decide what to do with their money. And for people like me, the unsophisticated investor, I can now only invest 10% of my portfolio without taking financial advice. Now, interesting, it's a traditional finance regulatory approach, and if one thinks about it, it doesn't actually honor the traditions of how crowdfunding mitigates its risk, because I can still go and take 10% of my investable portfolio and stick it in one investment. So it has no connection to the concept of atomization. It's a very traditional regulatory approach, and frankly, dumb. They're also bringing in additional regulations about the use of social media within a crowdfunding context. Ludicrous, stupid, respectful of very traditional ideas around investment models and traditional finance, and it does not play to those ideas of how crowdfunding mitigates risk, which is high levels of transparency, great participation, good conversation around these things. Anything that stands in the way of that, in my estimation, is not respecting crowdfunding and will do it no favors. If we look more widely, we can see other approaches that have been going on. In Italy, for example, Italy enabled a specific law to permit crowdfunding. They're now having to rewrite it because they got it wrong. Because it defined the boundaries. It said, you can do this, but you cannot do that. And they discovered that they didn't write the boundaries correctly, not least because they looked at it from a traditional finance point of view. United States is still waiting for Tier 3 to be empowered. Despite the fact that the Jobs Act went through many years ago now, and until Tier 3 is enabled, retail investors cannot get involved with equity-based crowdfunding. Consequently, crowdfunding of equities does not exist in the United States. They may tell you otherwise, but currently it doesn't. Still, again, a problem that it has to be enabled. They have to be permitted to do things. Australia, same sort of principle. They have been undertaking crowdfunding to a certain extent, as they might describe it, but they are still now realizing they have to bring retail investors into this. And in Germany had a fairly vibrant crowdfunding environment. The regulators are now seeking to retrospectively be bringing additional regulations, and you can look at crowdfunding activity in Germany has dropped off massively since the suggestion that these additional regulations are being brought in. So ill-informed, badly informed regulators making something a mess of it. The more the crowdfunding gets treated like traditional finance, the more problems that we have. I would suggest that the activities of the FCA within the UK, by not understanding the principles of crowdfunding, they are increasing risk. They are building systemic risk into crowdfunding because they're reducing transparency, they're reducing participation, they're reducing, consequently, the diligence, and they will drive up the average size of investment, which goes against the atomization principle. It reduces the actual specific unique values that come with crowdfunding for all of those reasons. It reduces engagement, reduces participation. By not embracing more people getting involved, it reduces diversity. The administration drives up costs, which is not good for the platforms. And it distorts the novel expectations of return. So we're actually turning this into traditional investment. And we can evidence this by the flow of institutional money that is going onto the platforms now. Huge amounts of institutional money going on, so it's not the crowd that owns this anymore. We have institutional funds. So here's an example. This is an example of how the funding structures have changed on one of the peer-to-peer lending platforms in the UK. This is one of the biggest business lending platforms. The grey section on the bottom of the graph there is the amount of institutional funding that came onto the platforms. And you can see that after April 2014, the point at which the FCA became engaged with this type of crowdfunding, the institutional money jumps up. This, in my mind, is a bad thing. It's turning crowdfunding into just more institutional investing. If we look also at CrowdFund is a great platform, love them to bits, great guys, but if we look at how things are changing, the average investment size has gone up from 2012, £1,854 to £2,600. It's averaging around £2,500 at the moment, but we've seen individual offers that have averaged up to £8,500 for each individual investment. This is not good for crowdfunding. It is building in risk. It is not playing to the strength of crowdfunding. Is there a solution? I think there probably is. I think we need to look to people like Mohammed Yunus that have great insight to how finance can be changed and how we need to change our view of how we manage it. Mohammed Yunus, as I'm sure many of you know, founder of the Grameen Bank, said this, and he's right: you cannot create the bank of the poor with the same architecture as the bank of the rich. It's the same with crowdfunding. You cannot create and regulate crowdfunding with the same regulations for traditional finance. They are not the same. And when he spoke about bank regulators also regulating microcredit institutions, he made the point that you can't do that. They don't understand the philosophy or procedures of this different type of credit. I would suggest that Mohammed Yunus, as usual, is ahead of the game, and we can look to this guidance for our approach to regulating crowdfunding. It's not too late, it still can be saved, and I hope that between us we can manage to do that. And I do hope that the biggest democracy in the world in India can help to democratize finance as well and take a very, very sensible regulatory approach. Sorry.